Proxima Centauri is not a star. Proxima Centauri is a low-mass star that is a part of the Southern Centaurus constellation. The star is 4.24 light-years away from Earth. If you had a powerful enough laser, it would take the beam of light 4.24 years to get to the star. When you look up that star, you're actually perceiving it as it was 4 years ago. The current fastest moving object made by man is the original Voyager probe. It's traveling over 35,000 miles per hour, and even at such an extreme velocity, it would take tens of thousands of years to reach the star. The only practical way to get there is via faster-than-light travel, or FTL for short. According to Einstein, a fundamental rule of the universe is nothing but light itself can go that fast. The year was 2037, and that was the year we broke that rule. But at what cost? My name is James Anderson. I've been with the Air Force for 15 years, and I've always said I was one of the best men they ever had. 2 years ago, I got an invitation from NASA to take part in a groundbreaking project. NASA was always a dream of mine. As a boy, I'd always dressed up as an astronaut for Halloween and read basically all the books on them, and the history of spaceflight and everything else. Joining the Air Force was the next best thing, and I ended up enjoying it a lot. I was stationed at Edwards Air Force Base as a test pilot for experimental fighters. The director of the project went by the name of Dr. Robert Butler. Robert was a tall, ginger man with a brain that would make even Einstein envious. Robert was the person who personally invited me to partake in his project. I accepted almost instantly when he called, and we set up a meeting to discuss the details. The meeting place was a nondescript office building in the middle of Bethesda, Maryland. Robert's office was probably the cleanest room I'd ever been in. He had a huge mahogany desk with a computer monitor that spanned almost half the desk in the corner. Behind him was a bookshelf full of books and miniature model aircraft. A pleasant autumn aroma filled the air with the incense he had burning on the other side of the room. Robert sat me down with a handshake and started. "Hello, James. Thanks for meeting with me today." "Thank you for having me. I'm excited to explore the opportunities in front of me." "Let's get the formalities out of the way so we can get down to business, shall we? I need you to sign a non-disclosure agreement as this project is classified top secret." Robert slid me a thick document. As I suspected, it was the aforementioned agreement. I'd signed thousands of these in the past, so I knew the drill. It basically said that if you discussed the project with anyone outside its scope, it was considered treason. I promptly signed the document with the expensive fountain pen he had on his desk, half expecting him to leap out of his seat, telling me it was a display piece only. He didn't. Passing the document back to him and returning the pen, I thanked him and asked, "So, what is this groundbreaking project you speak about?" "Are you familiar with the theoretical physicist Miguel Alcubierre?" Robert asked me with a curious expression. "Well, I've read about him. He theorized a way to travel faster than light, but that theory was disproved a long time ago." Robert sat back in his chair and went on. "What if I told you we recently revised his work and put it into practice?" Another question popped up into my head. Miguel's FTL engine required significant power to function. Nothing in the world can create that much energy. "Yes, James, legitimate question. The scientists at CERN Large Hadron Collider have been able to find a way to produce large amounts of antimatter. We've produced enough for a trip to Proxima Centauri and back, with a little extra." "So you've built a ship?" I asked. "Yes, we're calling it the Trieste, after the submersible piloted by Jacques Piccard that dove into the deepest depths of the ocean. It seemed the most appropriate," Robert replied. I was humbled to be part of something so much bigger than myself. I would have the chance to shape the future of mankind and affect many generations ahead of me. My heart certainly beating rapidly as I inquired, "How fast does it go?" "According to our calculations, the Trieste has a max velocity of 32.47 times the speed of light, and you're going to be her pilot." Before I could ask the date of the flight, he handed me a contract that outlined the whole project. Upon signing the contract, Robert set me up with living accommodations and held out his hand. I shook it and left to move into the apartment he provided for me. After I settled in for about a week, Robert invited me back to a spacious conference room to meet the others who would join me on the pioneering flight. Robert called 4 people into a line, each at the top of their respective fields and eager to change history. The first I was introduced to was an engineer, Dr. Pravina Cook. Pravina designed and helped construct the reactor and the FTL drive. She was a shorter woman, maybe just over 5 feet with long dark hair in her 30s. What she lacks in height, she makes up for in intelligence. The next person I was introduced to was Dr. Haruto Moon. Dr. Moon was a medical doctor. He was tall, with short hair and a suit. Haruto was recently in the running to become a surgeon general, so NASA jumped at the opportunity to invite him. Then I met the chief scientist, Dr. Elizabeth Murphy. Elizabeth was one of the most beautiful women I had ever set my eyes upon. Her eyes were like diamonds, my gaze transfixed upon her smiling face before the man next to her cleared his throat. I snapped out of it and shook her hand, and his. The man was the commanding officer of the Trieste, Colonel Edward Thompson. Thompson didn't look like the colonels I'd worked with over the years. He was short and thin, so not very intimidating. Before our handshake was finished, he leaned down in my ear and whispered, "I saw how you looked at Elizabeth. That's not what this mission is about, so if you would kindly keep your dick in your pants, this will all go over ever so smoothly." I nodded before joining him in line, and Robert handed each of us a glass of champagne and we gave a toast. To new horizons. We all clinked our glasses and socialized. The next day was orientation. We all met in the same conference room. It was that day I finally got to see the Trieste. Although it was only a render on the wall, it looked exactly like I was looking at the real thing. At the front of the craft was a large spherical command structure, probably where we controlled everything. Behind the sphere was what looked like a communications array. Then there was a reactor sandwiched between two vast rings. The rings were the main component of the FTL drive. Behind that, were the direct aft of the ship, were the main engines for standard propulsion. Flanking the reactor were two cylindrical tanks for the fuel. One had antimatter, the other tank contained matter. Those two substances emit vast amounts of energy when combined. The reactor controlled that and converted it into energy. Robert began to explain why he chose Proxima Centauri next. As you may already know, Proxima Centauri is the closest star to Earth other than the Sun. This makes it an excellent candidate for this project. That's not the only reason we chose it though. For a little over 40 years, that star has been emitting bursts of ultra-high energy radio waves. When analyzed, the signal is random in nature, basically bursts of static. Well, don't all stars emit all kinds of waves? I questioned. Yes, James, you're correct. The remarkable thing about these ones is they happen every hour on the dot. If that wasn't strange enough, every burst is completely identical. The room fell silent as everyone was in a state of shock. Robert chuckled. That was my exact reaction, guys. Your task is to travel to the star and use the equipment you bring along to study it and find out what causes these signals. I smiled when I saw the joy on Elizabeth's face. Stars were her area of study. Robert began answering more questions we had. Some important particulars stood out to me. The Trieste was still under construction in orbit. It's going to take 1.5 months to reach the star at max speed, and we're scheduled to depart in 1 year after vigorous training. Our orientation came to a conclusion and I decided to go home. NASA decided to put my body to its upper extreme limit over that year. I have never been tested like that, not even in my time in the Air Force. In one of the simulations, they put me into a chair in a spinner that spun me up to incredibly fast speeds to simulate G-forces. Another time, I got put into another chamber for several hours under high atmospheric pressure to see how I responded to the change. After many tests like this, my shipmates and I were ready to go. The launch day had arrived. This was a top secret mission, so the trip to the Soyuz rocket that would take us up was oddly void of reporters. I didn't have anyone to say goodbye to, which was one of the reasons I was selected, as there was every chance the ship could just plain explode. The Soyuz rumbled to life as it violently carried us up. I have never been so uncomfortable in such a comfortable seat. Eventually, the rumbling stopped, and I felt without weight. Moments later, Elizabeth screamed with excitement, "Look!" I watched out the window. Before me was the Trieste in all her magnificence. It was surrounded by the scaffolding used to help in the construction. The capsule docked with the ship, and we boarded. Before me was the command center, and the finest technology that humanity had to offer. At the front was a single grand console, my console, used for navigation. The ship oddly had gravity, although I didn't quite understand how it worked. I hiked across the spacious room to my console so I could examine it. To my left was a small joystick like the one you'd find in an arcade cabinet. It was used to control the reaction control thrusters that steered the ship. There was a camera system there so I could see where we were going, and directly in front of me was an extensive celestial map so I could see where we were and plot our courses. Overlaying the map were the controls for the FTL drive, which were simple. Pravina handled the complicated aspects naturally. Finally, to my right, was a simple throttle for the main engines and a multifunction display for factors like power levels and velocity. Colonel Thomas stepped in and shouted, "All right, everyone, to your stations." Pravina and Elizabeth took to their stations on either side of me. Elizabeth's station showed full access to the full suite of sensors and scanners installed on the ship. They allowed her to study the star. I don't even know how to explain Pravina's console. It was way too complex for me. My job at that moment was to make sure the navigation system was aligned and the engines were ready to fire so we could head out. We spent a couple of hours preparing as the scaffolding around the ship was taken away, and Robert called out over the radio. "All right, guys, everything looks good from our end. Proceed whenever you're ready." "Thank you, Robert. We'll be in contact when we're positioned to go to light speed," replied the colonel. "James, take us out." I tapped on my console, firing up the engines, and the ship gained speed. We could not perceive it due to the artificial gravity. The ship needed to be far from the Earth in case of disaster, though. If the ship were to go up, it'd be the equivalent to 500 megatons of TNT. The engines were incredibly powerful. On one camera gave me the view behind the ship, and the Earth was getting visibly smaller. Eventually, as we got at a range, it disappeared. I cut the engines and let the Trieste coast. "We're in position, sir," I informed Thomas. He relayed the information to control. "This is it. Charge the rings, James." I started the charge sequence and the ship began to hum as the rings roared to life. Looking at the readout, it said 2 minutes to charge. I responded out, "2 minutes to charge, sir," I shouted excitedly. There was an atmosphere of anxiety and excitement. Nobody there wasn't worried. My panel turned green as the coils finished charging. The colonel knew this and he had his seat. After the click from his harness, he addressed the crew. "Whatever happens, guys, you've all done your country proud. James, engage." I had the biggest smile on my face as I nodded and did as instructed. We heard a loud burst of energy. Colors dazzled our eyes as we gazed out the front window. What followed was an unnerving silence. I came to my senses and studied the panel in front of me. "Holding steady at 24.5 C. We are stable." A wave of relief washed over all of us before we started celebrating. What I saw out the window was hard to explain. It's like we were flying through a blue tunnel of light. Pravina promptly checked the drive for any issues, and she found none. We all congregated in the mess area for a meal while Dr. Moon examined himself and the rest of us for any negative effects of our transition to light speed. To his amazement, we all looked perfectly healthy. Dinner was disgusting, a freeze-dried chicken, or what looked like chicken and tasted kind of like rubber. Despite the horrible cuisine, we were all as happy as we could be. To us, at the time, we just made history. It was the life goal of every human being. We were so proud. Soon it was time to sleep for the long trip. Thompson ushered the crew into the sleeping chamber, and we each got into our respective pods. The pods were programmed to wake us up 5 hours before we reached Proxima Centauri. Pravina checked over the systems methodically before getting into her pod. She didn't want there to be any problems when we were all sound asleep. As my pod closed, I felt claustrophobic before gently drifting into a deep, deep slumber. I awoke seemingly minutes later to a blinding light. Dr. Moon and Elizabeth, with those beautiful eyes, were standing above me. She smiled and was saying, "We're here, James." I slowly sat up and got out of my pod. The 2 other crewmates were awake as well. Dr. Moon gave me a pill to help me recover from the extended rest, and I got out of my pod. Thomas asked me where we were. The trudge to my console was a little awkward as it felt like I was learning to walk again for the first time. The console read an ETA of 4 hours, 13 minutes, 53 seconds. I turned to Dr. Moon. "Doc, I thought we were supposed to wake at 5 hours, not 4 1/4. "You're right. We had a little trouble with your pod. It wouldn't open," he replied with a concerned expression. The crew and I spent the remaining 4 hours checking systems and getting food into our bodies. It was fish this time, equally rubbery and gross as the chicken. Eventually, it came time to shut down the drive as we had arrived. I shut it down and the ship came to a stop. There was a blinding light out of the window. I was looking at another star. It just sunk in. The gravity of what we just accomplished. I don't think I was the only one with that feeling either. Thompson shouted an instruction. Bring us into orbit of that star, James. With that permanent smile on my face, I acknowledged it and used my console to fire up the engines again and put us into orbit. Are we able to filter out all this blinding light? Thompson asked. Elizabeth spoke up. The window has a filter. One moment, I'll activate it. My heart hit the deck plating with an audible thud when she activated the filter. I observed the star being covered in a green, vine-like structure. It almost seemed organic. Proxima Centauri looked alive. It was visibly throbbing, and I was visibly terrified at the sight. What the hell? That's not what a star is supposed to look like, Thompson said, shocked. Elizabeth tapped her panel with determination. She concluded that with all the spectrographic analysis, the star was indeed organic, or there was nothing in her analysis that pointed it to being a star of any classification, other than the fact that it emitted a blinding light. How could we have not seen this without instruments on Earth? I concluded it was somehow able to trick them from that vast distance. Elizabeth noted with a puzzled expression. I don't understand how this is possible. How long until the next radio burst? Thomas asked. 5 minutes, she replied as she checked her panel. As we waited, I was a nervous wreck. 5 minutes came and went. The radio pulse came and went as well. I felt a slight tingling sensation, but it was harmless. We were monitoring the signal, and it was the same as previously recorded pulses, according to Elizabeth. What do you make of all this, Dr. Moon? The colonel asked, without diverting his gaze. Moon didn't respond. I could hear a soft, high-pitched wheezing coming from his direction. The colonel noticed too and turned around. Dr. Moon was completely motionless. Assuming he was just daydreaming, Thompson shouted, Dr. Moon! What happened next was the most disturbing, frightening thing I have ever witnessed. And that's saying something coming from a soldier like myself. Moon started violently convulsing before slowly changing into something. His arms, his legs, his fingers, his toes, his neck all grew to double their length. Sharp teeth descended from his gums, and existing teeth broke into sharp points. His jaw disconnected from his skull, giving him a gaping, terrifying maw. One of the panels behind him gave me a reflected view of his back as it split apart, exposing his spine with each vertebrae having long, jagged spikes protruding from them like a dinosaur. The same sort of spikes were also protruding from all the joints in his body. His skin turned a green, dark, mottled color and was now rippled, exposing bone and powerful muscular structure. There was nothing recognizable left. I sprinted at Elizabeth and grabbed her arm as we raced to safety. Ravina followed, but Colonel Thomas, rest his soul, wasn't so lucky. Moon, or what we thought was Moon, lunged at him with a high-pitched, unnatural screech, thrusting both arms into the colonel's chest, aided by the spikes that grew on the knuckles. Thomas didn't make a sound. He just went limp with his arms dangling below him. His motionless body was lifted off the ground, and I winced with horror. There was an explosion of blood and gore as the creature separated its arm, ripping the already deceased Colonel Thomas in half. His blood-soaked insides were scattered all over the room. In all my years of military service, I've never seen anything remotely more disturbing. With no time to mourn our fallen comrade, we moved into the mess and closed the door, locking it. The others were sobbing. None of us wanted to talk about what just happened, or what caused it. Ravina noted, still sobbing, "We need to kill it." Nobody ever guessed to pack weapons on this ship, as it was a mission of exploration, and this occurrence would never show up on any manual. The three of us collected ourselves, and I cracked open the door. Moon was pacing the room and noticed me. He produced another loud screech and charged at me. I got back inside just in time as he started banging on the door relentlessly. "Try and find something I can use as a weapon." "We may not need one. The main airlock is in the room with it. There's a console in the communications room opposite this door that can open it." Ravina said this, shaking with fear. I opened the door, and the creature was in the middle of the room, standing above the colonel as if it was admiring its latest kill. I threw a piece of metal past it, and the creature jumped at it where it hit the ground. I gathered up all my strength and determination I could muster and bolted for the communications room door. The creature saw me and got within inches, but I made it and sealed the door behind me. Moon, as if he knew what was about to happen, pounded much louder than before, almost desperate. I used the auxiliary console to increase the pressure and blow out the airlock. The environment outside the door sounded like a wind tunnel. The pounding ceased. I could hear it frantically claw at the ground before a loud puff sound, and it flew out helplessly. I resealed the airlock and pressurized it. Upon opening the door, both the creature and the colonel were gone, with deep claw marks in the ground and around the airlock. To my horror, I looked up and it had completely trashed the command deck. All of the consoles were destroyed with no way to use them. We were dead in the water with no way to control the ship. I called out to the others to tell them it was safe. They both took a look at my shocked face when presented with the carnage. "Can we activate the drive from the reactor room?" I asked Pravina. "Yes, but we would have no navigational control," she replied skeptically. With haste, we made our way to the reactor control room. The room was dissimilar from the rest of the ship. It had an industrial design. Pravina did her magic to try and charge the rings with before another burst, but there was no way to know which one of us would change into that thing next. Her fingers tapped away at an inhuman pace and she froze. "No, no, 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 no!" "What?" Elizabeth and I responded in unison. "The rings aren't charging. The creature must have hit one of them when it flew out of the airlock," she said with a defeated look on her face. I felt as if the entire universe was trying to kill us. The three of us went to the window and we were shocked to discover there was a deep gash on the side of one of the rings. That meant the only chance we had was with the main engines. If we could get far enough away, we could try to fix the rings with a spacewalk. But we had no way of knowing how far the pulse had an effect, and we wasted no time in starting them up to get them going from the reactor room either. Pravina put all of the available power straight through the engines, including power from life support. 30 minutes later, we were going fast enough that I thought I could perceive the organic star drifting away slowly. There were 15 minutes until the next burst. The three of us took shelter with nothing left to do and separated ourselves with just the doors between us, just in case we weren't far enough away from the star. The engines were still going strong. We were keeping in constant contact using the internal comm system. Elizabeth monitored for the burst, and the three of us had never been so scared in our lives, as we knew now was potentially about to happen to us. Our fate was inevitable. The burst came, and it went, and the two started sobbing again. As far as I could tell at that moment, we were all safe. I broke down with the relief, as it was one issue we no longer had to deal with. And then one of them stopped crying. "Elizabeth?" "I'm here, James. I'm here." That same screech came out of the speakers. It was so loud, my eardrums were in searing pain. I called for Pravina, but it was already too late for her. She was in the pod room. Elizabeth was the only thing on my mind at that time now. I had a clear path to get to her. She was in the communications room. I went over and joined her there. We had an hour left. The two of us knew that there was no chance of repairing the ring without Pravina, and Pravina started pounding on her door as the transformation was now complete. I am writing this from that room with Elizabeth. I don't know if my story will reach Earth. Even if it did, it'd be too late for us, as it takes a whole 40 years with lightspeed communications. We're just too far away. Pravina busted out of the pod room. She knows where we are, and started trying to do the same thing to this door. I don't know how long we have left. I don't know what will get to us first, Pravina or the next burst. All I know is, we don't want to die in either fashion. I'm contemplating evacuating the air from this room. Elizabeth agreed and started sobbing uncontrollably. I'm embracing her with one arm and writing this with the other. The air's getting thin. Humans can survive for about 6 minutes without oxygen. It's an agonizing death, but it's far, far better than the alternative. I do not regret going on this mission. Neither does Elizabeth. We are fortunate to have made our world proud. If you are reading this message, please stay away from Proxima Centauri. It's not what it seems. This room is now completely devoid of oxygen. Elizabeth has gone unconscious. I'm devastated, but I don't know that I'll be that way for much longer. Only one thing left to do. Send.